topic of my talk today is probably the most influential piece of clinical research on homeopathy that's taken place in several years. What we've been referring to informally as the Australian report, which is actually the result of an investigation by the National Health and Medical Research Council, which is a government-funded research institute in Australia, who did an overview of all systematic reviews on homeopathy for any health condition in humans. So that was a huge remit. They identified 57 systematic reviews covering 61 health conditions. They wrote this up as an overview report to the extent of about 600 pages. And then they summarized the findings of that report in an information paper, 40 pages long, just in plain English, to inform the Australian public. And the conclusion presented in this information paper is that there are no health conditions for which there is reliable evidence that homeopathy is effective, and therefore homeopathy should not be used to treat health conditions that are chronic, serious, or could become serious, which is quite a definitive finding. So you can imagine they did the usual thing when you do a major report. They did a media release, a publication in March 2015, and they said that the conclusions had been based on the findings of a rigorous assessment of more than 1,800 papers, and that their review had showed there was no good quality evidence to support the claim that homeopathy works better than placebo. And that was a quote directly from the chief executive, Warwick Anderson. This, of course, was picked up by the international media, both at the time of publication, then again in February last year, with really damning headlines, which damaged the reputation of homeopathy globally. So, as soon as you take a look at this report in any detail, you see that the key word is reliable. Their conclusion is hinging entirely on their definition of reliable evidence. And their definition is that a trial has to be good quality, well-designed, and with enough participants for a meaningful result. That's what the public have been told, and it sounds entirely reasonable. The problem is that when you look at how they define that, you find out that trials had to have a minimum of 150 participants, and they had to have a quality score on a rating scale of 5 out of 5. That's the JDAD scale. There were other scales, but they had to be equivalent to 5 out of 5. If a trial failed on either of those criteria, the results of that trial were dismissed on the basis that the studies were of insufficient size and/or quality to warrant further investigation of their findings. So, at HRI, when we started looking at this, we thought, even though there are many, many problems with this report, we realized that that 150 and that quality threshold were the biggest issues. So we looked first at the impact just of those two issues. We looked at where this 1,800 came from, and we found that, yes, they started off with just over 1,800 studies because that was the result of their literature search. Now, anyone who's been involved in systematic reviews knows that you do this big sweeping search first of all, but it picks up all sorts of nonsense, all sorts of studies that have nothing to do with what you're trying to study. So you never normally talk about that number. It's pretty irrelevant. So the first thing to understand is that this report drew its conclusions on 176 trials that the reviewers quite correctly said this is what we actually want to be studying here. So the 1,800 is a real red herring. When they had dismissed all the trials that were smaller than 150, that brings the data set down to 30 trials. We then applied their quality threshold of 5 out of 5 and found that if you then do that, you are left with just 5 trials that meet NHMRC's definition of reliable trials. Their analysis was that all 5 of those trials that met their reliability criteria were negative in the sense that they didn't show homeopathy to be effective. So that was how they were then able to say there is no reliable evidence homeopathy is effective for 58 out of the 61 conditions that they were looking at. What really stunned me, though, was they also drew the really firm, definitive conclusion that homeopathy is not more effective than placebo for 13 health conditions, when they've said that only 5 trials were reliable. So they are drawing conclusions on data they've said is not reliable. So it's really not great. Now, if anyone is going to stand up and say that a report written by a leading research institution with a global reputation is poor quality. You obviously have to be able to back that up. And so the first thing we did was we tried to establish how unusual this method was, the 150 and the quality threshold. Now, the Australians used what's called a Cochrane overview method that is spelt out explicitly in the Cochrane handbook as to how you do this. So we looked for other Cochrane overviews, and there are 16 that have been published, and none of them have a minimum sample size, and none of them use quality thresholds, so this is completely unprecedented. We then looked at other reviews done by NHMRC that were as similar as possible to the homeopathy review. They have no minimum trial size in them. And in fact, their information paper on the effects of lead was drawing conclusions on trials as small as 52. So then we looked broader and said, well, what do other people do? BMJ clinical evidence reviews are the most comparable with NHMRC, that again, world-class, world-famous, very highly respected. They do have a minimum sample size, but that's 20. And we looked at what would have happened if the Australians had used that, because that would be reasonable, because that has a precedent to it. And we worked out that if they'd done that with their data set of the 176 trials, we would have lost the results of 10 trials, not 146. So I think you can understand that when a charity such as HRI is dedicated to the objective and fair and accurate communication of evidence, we felt something had to be done to challenge this. And we were approached by the Australian Homeopathic Association to co-author a challenge to this report. And the avenue that's open is called the Ombudsman route, which is because NHMRC receive public funds, they are accountable via the Ombudsman's office, and you can challenge them. So we joined forces for several months to produce a complaint that was submitted and is in the process of trying to challenge this report. Jerry was in charge of identifying potential bias, potential conflict of interest, and one of the first things he found through Freedom of Information Act requests and other methods was that the Homeopathy Working Committee that was in charge of this report was initially chaired by Professor Peter Brooks, who is a member of was at the time, a member of Friends of Science in Medicine, which is a recognized anti-homeopathy lobby group. Now, as soon as that conflict of interest was exposed, because he had actually ticked a sign saying he was not a member of any such organization, he stepped down because he was busy with other matters, but he stayed on the committee. And it's important to know this was a hands-on committee. They made decisions about the protocol, about the analysis that directly influenced the results. We also found that there was not one homeopathy expert on this committee. Now, that is unprecedented at NHMRC. You always have a topic expert as part of the group doing the review. For obvious reasons, you have to have the specialist expertise to know what you're reviewing. So we had established that there was the potential for bias to have occurred. The next step was to demonstrate that bias did occur and that the results were altered in some way. Now, to me, the most shocking thing that Jerry found was that the review was done twice. Now, I really could hardly believe it myself when he told me this. And trying to explain to non-scientists just how shocking it is that you did the whole thing twice and you didn't tell anyone, it's quite hard to convey that. But the first time they did it was April to August 2012, and that was completely hidden from the public. They say that it was rejected on the grounds of quality, not the results. It was the quality was the problem. But when you're assessing how likely that is, the lead author is one of the people who wrote NHMRC's guidelines telling the rest of the world how to review evidence. They are still refusing to release that first review, even under Freedom of Information requests, claiming that there's some kind of business, contractual reason that they can't. We are still asking to see that first review. So one thing to bear in mind is for the rest of my presentation, and when the world talks about the Australian report, we're talking about the second time they did it. From December 2012 to March 2015, they hired a new contractor called Optum, and they worked with them to produce this overview report, which does have issues in terms of its quality and its analysis, which have led to misreporting. So when I'm saying it's poor quality, what do I mean specifically? Most of the problems with this overview stem from the fact that they used an inappropriate method. So we all know here that when you do a systematic review, you take multiple individual studies and you summarize them into a review. So when you're doing an overview, you are taking lots of systematic reviews and summarizing those. So it's common sense that an overview can only be as good as the quality of the systematic reviews that are inside it. So Cochrane are specific in their handbook that this is intended for summarizing Cochrane reviews because they are inherently of a certain standard, but they say you can also use it for other non-Cochrane high-quality reviews. Now, Optum assessed the 57 systematic reviews, and they said, unfortunately, only 7 were high quality. So that means only 12% of the data in this report was suited to the method being used. What's happened because of that is it means that there is essential data that is either inconsistent or missing amongst the systematic reviews. Now, what you normally do when you do an overview is if that happens, you've got 2 systematic reviews talking about the same trial and giving you different information, you do the obvious thing. You go to the original study, you pick it up, you read it, and you find out what the correct information is. NHMRC chose not to do that, which is highly unusual. But they say in their documents we had to rely on how the trials were reported in the systematic reviews, and they did not have to. They chose to. What they did instead was they said, if a sample size is inconsistent, they will assume it's the smallest size given. If the quality is not reported at all, they will assume it's a poor quality trial. So we looked at the impact of this. Now, doing the entire 600 pages would have been a bit much. So we took one chapter, allergic rhinitis, and we found that 7 of the 15 trials in that chapter had the wrong sample size. We then looked at the impact of their rule about quality, and we found that 44 trials in this report have a quality that has been assumed to be poor. Now, how many of those were actually poor or not? Who knows? But it means that a quarter of the data, we don't know if it's correct or not. So we looked to see if we could see that that had actually altered the results, and we found that for sure, one good quality study that was positive on the homeopathic product Synfrontal had got lost from the results. It had been assumed to be poor quality when it wasn't. It was good. Another important issue here is that when you do an overview, can you see that there's a risk you might miss individual trials that don't just happen to be inside a systematic review? They might have been done more recently, or there might not be a systematic review in that area. So it's usual to search for systematic reviews and individual trials. They chose not to. They said that the risk of missing data was offset by doing a public consultation and asking other people to send them data, which is slightly unusual for a world-class institute. So to realize what happened with this, they found 176 studies they believed meted their inclusion criteria. The public and homeopathy research groups sent them loads of data, but within that, they say 49 studies met their inclusion criteria. So that's 22% of the evidence that they didn't even find themselves had to be sent to them, and out of that data, 0 entered the review. So that means that this overview, when you pick it up and it's supposed to summarize the field for you as a researcher, is missing 22% of the data, full stop. That only exists in a separate document called the Review of Submitted Literature. So the problems really do pile up. So I thought it would be helpful to look at a couple of individual health conditions that they looked at and sort of think, well, this is the data we have, so what happened to it? Now, an obvious place to start was diarrhea in children, because we know we have strong data there, so what happened to that? Now, this is NHMRC's evidence statement that appeared time and again for each health condition. The studies are of insufficient size or quality. There is no reliable evidence for this condition. So, for diarrhea in children, we know that we have 3 individual RCTs. We know that there was a positive trend, followed by 2 statistically significant positive results. And then we know that Jennifer Jacobs pulled these results into a very strong meta-analysis with a nice p-value. So this is very solid data. Now, because of the 150 rule, can you see we immediately lose all 3 of the RCTs? And that only leaves the meta-analysis. So what happened to the meta-analysis? Now, interestingly, Optum themselves found it and said originally it's in the 176, it's in the study. It was also sent by other people, but they said it's a non-systematic review, so we can't use it, but it's not a review. So that, should we assume that's a typo? So we then looked for another reason they might not have included it, and we found that they had decided for some reason to exclude all meta-analyses from this overview, which again is very unusual. And their reason for that was they said that all of the meta-analyses contained studies within them that were poor quality, so they couldn't be trusted, if you like. Now, there's a problem with that argument. It's wrong. The Jennifer Jacobs meta-analysis contains 3 studies. 1 is medium, 2 are good. So there is no poor quality data in that piece of work, and it means they have not given a single legitimate reason for excluding it. Obviously, allergic rhinitis is another area we have a lot of data. So for the Ombudsman, I'm not expecting you to take this in, but we presented the whole data set to them as it should have been done, breaking it down into different types of homeopathy, different types of medicines combined, individualized, etc. So they knew what should have been there. The Australians only talked about 1 study specifically, which was the Riley study on hay fever, and this had 144 participants in it. They said it was good quality. They said it was positive, statistically significant. So what happened to it? They actually said for this one that it was unreliable only because it hadn't been repeated or there was no other data to support its findings. Now, of course, if you want to draw firm conclusions, you have to repeat trials and you have to support them with other research teams doing something similar. But to say that this study of itself is unreliable purely because it hasn't been repeated is entirely unacceptable. And just out of interest, they said they had to rely on the information in the systematic reviews. They couldn't go to the originals. They made 1 exception in 600 pages. They corrected this one. Because in the systematic reviews, this is 158 people. They went to the original and found out it was 144, so they corrected it. So, upper respiratory tract infections, we know, is a really strong area for us. So I was intrigued as to what they'd done here. Now, I realized there was no point doing a full analysis of this chapter as soon as I realized that they'd based it only on trials that said URTI in the actual heading, literally specifically, this is a study on URTIs. So that's 7 trials. What they didn't do in this chapter was include any evidence on individual medical conditions that fall under the umbrella diagnosis of URTI. So we went through the whole report and found that there were studies in there that they had already analyzed on these URTIs, bronchitis, cough, flu, otitis media, and sinusitis, that weren't in the chapter. So that chapter is utter nonsense. It's completely meaningless. So in the Ombudsman's Challenge, we felt we had to really show that the 2 key quotes that are in their executive summary, which we know is what the world has read. They won't read the 600-page document. They probably won't read the 40-page document. They will read the 2-page executive summary. And this is what is in the executive summary. No good quality studies, not 1, and therefore no evidence whatsoever that's reliable. And our arguments are that that is inaccurate and highly misleading to the public. And we've justified that by presenting the Ombudsman with studies, specific studies that have unjustifiably been taken out of the results. And by that we mean the reviewers knew about them, they met their inclusion criteria, and they also met their definition of good quality, 5 out of 5 on the JDAS scale. So really the only issue with them is they had less than 150 people in them, or they were lost by their quality, screening or something bizarre. So these are what the public should have been told about. And we focused on these 5 health conditions because basically our feeling is if you've shown that 5 of these chapters are wrong, and that's 5 pieces of information are wrong, the entire report should be rescinded. So it's not just the homeopathic world that has criticisms of this review. Other world-class organizations have expressed concern about this review during the peer review process. And finally, I know it's a bold thing to say, but you have to look at whether this was accidental this is just a judgment call, this is just a different way of reviewing evidence or something along those lines, or was this deliberate bias? And in the end, we did decide that as they are the NHMRC, which means they are world leaders in reviewing evidence, they knew exactly what they were doing. They knew how unusual it was, they knew the impact it would have on the results, and therefore it is a case of misfeasance and not scientific error.